For time's sake, we're gonna get going with things. Hello and welcome everyone to our second OKPAN hosted Oklahoma Archaeology Month event. My name is Kate Newton and I'm the director of the Oklahoma Public Archaeology Network, or OKPAN. And I am honored tonight to welcome Dr. Chip Colwell and Mr. Gordon Yellowman this evening to discuss repatriation, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and the question many of us here today have become fairly familiar with, which is who owns the past and the items that connect us to our history. This question is a simple one in its simplicity, since once asked, one must inevitably stand toe-to-toe with issues of ethics, civil rights and liberties, human agency, sovereignty, the survival and well-being of living people today, Western and Indigenous ideas of what is art and what isn't, and how we understand, make sense of, and speak to a history that is fraught with extremes of difficulty, grief, and mistrust. And finally, the question of who owns the past also leads us to ask how we might heal the wounds of the past, how we might move forward more thoughtfully and conscientiously, and how we might work together toward a future that is more just and frankly more kind. Tonight, I am so pleased to be able to introduce our two featured speakers. Gordon Yellowman is the Cheyenne Chief of the Southern Cheyenne Nation and is an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. He has extensive knowledge of Cheyenne history, customs, traditions, and religious beliefs. He has 20+ years experience working and administering federal and tribal programs. Gordon has curated 5 exhibitions on various cultural and art topics of Cheyenne and Arapaho arts and traditional arts. He is co-author of numerous exhibition catalogs and scholarly texts. He is also currently serving as the director of the Language and Culture Program for the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. He has worked for 28 consecutive years for his tribe's government and has 20 years experience working with federal mandates such as NAGPRA and the National Historic Preservation Act. He was also the chairman of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History's Repatriation Review Committee for 9 years. Tonight, we are also joined by the author of the book, Plundered Skulls and Stolen Spirits, Dr. Chip Colwell. Chip is the founding editor for the widely acclaimed digital magazine Sapiens, published by the Wenner-Gren Foundation. Previously, he held the position of Senior Curator of Anthropology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. He received his PhD from Indiana University and has held fellowships with Archaeology Southwest, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the U.S. Fulbright Program. He is the author of numerous scholarly articles and has published more than 11 books. His current research is focused on an NSF-funded project which aims to understand ethical issues and implications studying ancient DNA from multiple perspectives, including those of Indigenous community leaders and scientists. Repatriation is a topic with enormous consequence. And in light of its importance and the experience of our guests here tonight, we could talk endlessly about these issues. Instead, however, we will focus largely on Dr. Colwell's recent book, Plundered Skulls and Stolen Spirits, Inside the Fight to Reclaim Native America's Culture. This book, winner of multiple awards, including the National Council of Public History Book Award and the Society for Historical Archaeology James Dietz Book Award, is a result of Chip's personal experiences as curator at the Denver Museum, as well as the Denver Museum's long and sometimes turbulent history in regards to Native American relations and repatriation. Perhaps one of the most moving sections of the book focused on the horrific events that took place at Sand Creek in eastern Colorado in 1864, where militia from Denver massacred Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children. Some of these Cheyenne and Arapaho ancestors' remains eventually were curated by our country's preeminent museums, including the Smithsonian and the Denver Museum. This book chronicles the Cheyenne Arapaho's nation's quest to repatriate their ancestors, including Gordon Yellowman's tireless work to bring his people home. It is a powerful story, and if you haven't read it yet, I expect you will after tonight's discussion. And with that, I'll leave it to Chip and Gordon, who will both speak for a few minutes, and following which we will begin our Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation and for joining us wherever you might be tonight. I personally am here in Denver, Colorado. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that Colorado is actually the home to 48 tribal nations all across the American West. And so I hope wherever you might be tonight that you pause to reflect, to acknowledge the Native peoples who once lived where you're at and perhaps still call it home. So one night in 1971, a woman named Maria Pearson was at home cooking dinner. Her husband worked for the Iowa Department of Transportation. He was a civil engineer. And he came through the door that work night like he did most nights, but she could tell he was upset. And she asked him what happened. And he said, well, something happened at work and you're really not gonna like this. And he said, well, what? What happened? Tell me. He said, well, you remember a few weeks back, I told you that, that new highway we're building outside of town, that we hit a historic cemetery. And, we called out the archaeologists and they finally got to work. And today they finished excavating the remains of 26 people. And they picked up all those people, they put them in new coffins and reburied them in the new cemetery in town. But the archaeologists also found one more person, the 27th person, that they determined was Native American. We now think probably Potawatomi. And she died with her child. Well, those archaeologists packed up that person and the child, and instead of reburying her in the cemetery in town, took her to the office of the state archaeologist. So Maria Pearson was immediately enraged by this. She also went by the name Running Moccasins, and she was Yankton Sioux. But she was 38 years old, a housewife, a mother of 6 children, not a political activist in any way. And she understood immediately that this was discrimination, that this was an injustice, but she didn't know what to do about it. So she finished making dinner, and after dinner, according to her, as she later told the story, she went outside and she listened. And she heard the wind moving through the trees in the yard, and she believed her grandmother's voice came to her on the wind. And her grandmother spoke to her and said that she had to do something. And Maria went back and forth with her saying, what can I possibly do? And the grandmother finally convinced her that she had to take action. So she came back in that night, and John, her husband, looked at her and could tell she was still really upset. And she said, honey, what are you going to do? And she looked him dead in the eye and she said, John, you don't want to know what I'm going to do. Well, she went to bed that night, and the next morning she woke up, and I'm going to now read from the book because this recounts Maria's own words, I think can more perfectly capture what happened next more than I could by summarizing it. So the next morning, Maria Pearson arose to make breakfast and get the kids ready for school. Once the house was quiet, she went to the closet and opened her grandmother's trunk. A musty smell of leather filled the room. She shook off her clothes and dressed in a white buckskin dress, beaded along the neckline with swaying fringe around the shoulders, sleeves, and hemline. She put on matching beaded moccasins and plaited her hair into 2 long braids. Then Pearson got into her car and drove the 90 miles east to Des Moines until she reached the Gold Dome, Iowa Capitol building. Pearson walked into Governor Robert D. Ray's office. Can I help you? The receptionist asked, startled by Pearson's traditional clothing. Yes, I've come to see the great white father. You tell him that Running Moccasins is here. Pearson was both dramatizing her role as an Indian emissary and channeling it. Once she started this theater, it could not stop. A man came out of the office in a suit and a black bow tie. Can I help you? He inquired. Are you the great white father? No, he explained. He was just an aide to the governor. Well, then you cannot help me, Pearson answered. Well, the governor is a very busy man, he said. Well, I am a very busy woman. What is it that you want to discuss? The aide persisted. You are not the great white father. I need to see him. If I were an ambassador from a foreign country, you would have that red carpet rolled out all the way down to the airport, and you would have a delegation there to greet me. Well, I am an ambassador. I am an ambassador for my people. And if this man, the governor, is over everybody in the state of Iowa, then he is over me, and I have a right to see him. retreated to another office. From behind the office door, Governor Ray peeked at running moccasins. The aide returned. The governor will see you. Pearson walked into Governor Ray's spacious chamber. He stood in front of a massive desk. They shook hands. Have a seat, Governor Ray offered. Pearson considered the big, overstuffed chairs. No, thank you. I can stand for what I have to say. Well, how can I help you? You can give me back my people's bones, and you can quit digging them up. The governor looked at his aide. Do we have her people's bones? The governor's aide quickly exited and made a phone call. He learned something about the situation with the Iowa Department of Transportation. The governor responded by personally calling the state archaeologist, demanding answers soon. He hung up the phone. How long has this been going on? Governor Ray asked Pearson. Let me see. How long have you been here? 500 years. For 500 years, you have been digging up my people. Pearson had heard the governor's mother was ill. She continued, if your mother died and you buried her, what would you think if I decided to do my home in early white man decor and went to the cemetery and dug up your mother? What if I took her wedding ring or her glasses? I might want those glasses she wears. How would you feel? Oh, that's a horrible thought, the governor sympathized. That should not happen to anybody. It happens to us and our people, she answered, and it's time for this to stop. So that story gives you a sense of some of the early battles and struggles by Native peoples to put an end to essentially laws in the United States that were applied in two different ways, one for Native Americans and one for non-Native Americans. What's really central to understand about Pearson's story is that the archaeologists in 1971 Iowa were not malicious. They weren't out to try to undermine the rights of Native peoples. In fact, they were just simply following Iowa state law that said if Native Americans were buried in unmarked burials, then they were archaeological resources for the state. So what had to change was not only ideas and ideas of justice and rights of Native peoples, but also the laws themselves. And while Native Americans had long resisted the appropriation of their ancestors' remains as well as sacred objects for many, many years, it really wasn't until on the heels of the civil rights movement of the 1960s that a large-scale national movement was able to unfold, in which Native peoples were able to more compellingly and persuasively argue for political and legal changes in the United States. So there was about 20 years of really strenuous and intense battles and struggles over trying to figure out a way forward on the part of all parties. And this movement culminated in 1990 on November 16th, almost exactly 30 years ago now, November 16th, 1990, when then President George H.W. Bush signed into law the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Now, this law does many things. It's 17 pages long, has all these different parts, but most fundamentally, it is a kind of human rights law that establishes a process for lineal descendants in Native American tribes to reclaim ancestral remains as well as certain kinds of cultural items from federal agencies and federally funded museums in the United States. The law, has lots of ups and downs to it. Many people may debate whether or not it's been a success, and maybe that's something we can talk about with Gordon and all of you tonight. But just some of the facts and figures. So in the past 30 years, somewhere about 60,000 Native American individuals or parts of them from U.S. museums have been culturally affiliated, which essentially creates the key step for their return to tribes or lineal descendants. And so about 60,000 individuals, about 1.7 million grave goods or belongings found in graves, and then about 15,000 sacred objects and communally owned objects. In 2007, I joined the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and as a curator, an anthropology curator, but I was also put in charge of the museum's NAGPRA program. So I was helping to lead the museum in complying with this federal law. And as I did that work, I began to see just how complicated it was. You know, I felt like a lot of times in the newspaper, you would just hear about a dispute, you know, or maybe finally something going home. But what I found so fascinating and important about the work of NAGPRA was the ways in which it intersects science and spirituality, law and ethics, you know, history and society. And so I wanted to work on a book that would help kind of capture really the complexities of this law and the way it's shifting and has shifted both Native communities and museum professionals. So in summary, I just wanted to highlight what I think I could say about kind of three key things, three key elements that demonstrate why repatriation matters today, and perhaps more than ever, even 30 years after the passage of NAGPRA. The first is, I would suggest that NAGPRA and repatriation helps preserve cultures by perpetuating them. So for a very long time, museum professionals, anthropologists, people who looked like me and that were in my positions, you know, in these museums, thought they were preserving culture by preserving the objects themselves. And I think what repatriation helps us understand is that while there's often great value to that, that alone, the preservation of the object, will not preserve living cultures. And this comes to us right at a time where there is a true renaissance and resurgence amongst many Native communities, where they're reviving traditions, cultural practices, and the return of sacred objects and the closure provided by the return of their ancestors is a way for museums and archaeologists and anthropologists to participate in this revival and the perpetuation of Native cultures. Second, I think repatriation is really important because it is turning museums into what a Zuni colleague of mine, Jim Enote, calls mediating spaces. And if you think about what museums are having to grapple with when it comes to repatriation and repatriation claims, these are sometimes some of the most horrific events in our country's history. And as you heard in the introduction, for example, one thing that I had to navigate at the Denver Museum was the presence of the victim from the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, a scalp that had been taken supposedly from an Arapaho chief. And so when we're talking about repatriation, we're not just talking about objects, we are talking about colonialism, we are talking about imperialist histories, we're talking about the confrontation of the sometimes even intentional destruction of Native American communities and cultures. And through repatriation, through these conversations and negotiations, we're actually able to mediate those histories and in some sense come to terms with them. And finally, I would suggest that repatriation points to the possibilities of what we could call a restorative justice. So political philosophers talk about justice in all different kinds of ways. There's, for example, retributive justice, which is the idea of kind of an eye for an eye or punishment focused justice. But the problem with that, with repatriation, is that often the people who perpetrated the worst harms are no longer with us. So there's kind of no one left to punish in a sense. There's also what political philosophers might call distributive justice, which is how do we as a society share certain kinds of goods like healthcare or education. But that also doesn't seem quite right because here we're talking about very specific kinds of human and cultural rights. So restorative justice is a form of justice that tries to heal the breaches of history. It's the kind of justice that we see with truth and reconciliation commissions, where it is a coming together of those who are systematically oppressed and those who are part of systems of oppression. And they come together to try to find a new future together. And it's through that kind of coming together that in and of itself becomes a kind of healing process. And I think this is what we often see with repatriation. Yes, sometimes just returning say the scalp of a massacre victim, that is simply the right thing to do. But for the people who are living today, those who have to make those negotiations, it's that process of negotiation that does give us some sense of healing and closure and provides perhaps a new measure of possibility. So the work of NAGPRA and the book itself that I wrote was not possible at all without a lot of guidance and instruction from tribal elders, from people like Gordon Yellowman. So I'm incredibly honored to have had the chance to work with Gordon and to have continued to work with him since the book came out on a few projects. And I'm so glad he is here to join us tonight. So Gordon, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, and then I think the plan is to go into a conversation from there.
I said, good evening. Welcome. One of the things that Chip covered in his presentation is he really covered a lot of words that are very commonly used in the process of developing policy or laws. And one of the things that when I first start interpreting or trying to process the word repatriation, it was very difficult for me because it was a word that was unknown. It was a word that was, we never heard of it in our tribe. And so NAGPRA, when it first came to our tribe, there was a lot of inundated letters that came to our tribal chairman. And these letters were stacked up high on his desk in piles. And so he stopped me one day and he said, Gordon, I'm getting some letters here and I don't really understand why they're writing me these letters. Can you check into it? And I said, yeah, sure. And I said, well, why are you asking me to check into it? He said, because you're a Cheyenne Chief and you're a ceremonial leader, you're a ceremonial participant, you know our traditions and our customs. And so that was kind of what gave me the authority, I guess, gave me the right to start looking at these letters. And so I started reading them letters and finally determined that there were, the law was allowed for the museums and other institutions that receive federal funding. They had to write summaries, and they had to provide those summaries to each tribe that those remains might be culturally affiliated with. That was the first step. The second step was the inventories. They had to write inventories in their collections of all the human remains, the associated funerary objects. All of that language that's written in the law was very powerful, overwhelming for us. And so I started reading it, and then I separated summaries, inventories, and I start addressing these letters, because these letters wanted us to acknowledge that they received it, the summaries and inventories. So that's what I started doing, and then I started reading the law over and over. And finally, I said, you know, I'm just gonna have to physically go and repatriate, learn this process myself. And no one's gonna give me a guidance book. No one's gonna tell me step 1, step 2, step 3. And there was nothing like that. So I told my chairman at that time, I said, I'm gonna go on ahead and start looking at repatriating some of our ancestors here. And let's see how we can do this. So we start looking at all the inventories and summaries and identifying what was Cheyenne, what was Arapaho. And we were able to write a grant. I wrote a grant to start, the grant was to develop a catalog of inventories, a catalog of summaries, and start creating priorities. And what was the priority for our tribe in repatriation? We had to prioritize what was important to us. And the most important thing to us was our ancestors, the Cheyenne people, the Arapaho people, and the culturally identifiable, the culturally unidentifiable. We prioritize those would come later. But for now, let's get our people home and let's do this. So that's how we started. And I wrote a grant for the very first consultation visit to the museums. I went all over the United States. I went to Denver, start looking at collections and then figuring out how I was going to do this. And then we ran into another law. It wasn't strictly NAGPRA. And so when we went to the Smithsonian, to the National Museum of Natural History Museum, the Smithsonian Institution is not subject to NAGPRA. They follow the NMAI Act, which is the National Museum of the American Indian Act. And that came prior to NAGPRA. So we had to follow a whole different law to repatriate those 13 remains that came from Sand Creek and came from Kansas, came from different forts. And so that was in 1993, we put in a request to repatriate. We went through the formal process of doing all the paperwork. And then one of the things that the Smithsonian was very strict about their policies, very strict about their rules of how they did things in-house. And most museums are like that. They're gonna have policies. They're gonna have accession, de-accessioning forms. And I'm assuming that de-accessioning forms were less than the accession forms. And so it kind of outweighs the balance of, hey, what is this? And so once we did our formal request, then the researchers, the NAGPRA people that worked on the NMAI, the caseworkers is what they're called. They start doing the research. They provide a document in the process of your request to repatriate. And once they have all the findings and determine that it does meet the requirements of repatriation, then you can start the process of returning them. And then again, going into the policies in-house of how they do things. When they called us, they said, we're ready to return the remains to your people. And they said, we're going to pack them in cardboard boxes. And we're going to fill the boxes with peanut foam for the fill. And that's the way we packed all the things here at the Smithsonian. And they were going to put them in a crate, and then we're going to ship them home to you. And so I told the elders here in the community what they were going to do, and their feelings was hurt. They said, that's disrespect to our people. They're going to do what? And I said, yeah, we have to follow their policies. So then they said, no, we're going to do it our way, but we're going to meet their policies. So we built cedar boxes, and we used the cedar shavings of our sacred trees, the cedar trees, to fulfill the meeting requirements of the popcorn peanut foam. And we, instead of them wrapping the bones and the skulls in plastic, bubble foam paper, we used buckskins and cloth, tray cloth. And we took all of that to our ceremony, and we had it all blessed. And we told them we're going to come after our remains. We're going to drive to Washington, D.C., and we're going to pick them up and pack them ourselves. So we did that, and we got up there, and I was part of the film crew because we wanted to document the process of repatriation. And there's a video out called The Long Journey Home. I encourage all of you to watch that video. It was supposed to be used as a model of how to repatriate your ancestors and returning them home. So one of the things when we got there was a ceremony done by our ceremonial priest, and all the remains were on a big long table. And as they uncovered them, they said, here they are. As they uncovered them with the white sheets they were covered with, it brought pain. It brought so much pain to us that we cried. And it brought back hard feelings. It brought back emotions, high emotions of crying for our ancestors, and to see them in that way. And then we immediately brushed them off with sage. And that's another thing. They told us you're going to have to wear white gloves to handle these remains. And they said, no, we're going to use white sage to cleanse the remains and cleanse ourselves. That sage protects us physically and spiritually, as well as the remains. So it neutralizes and we become one again in physical and spiritual connection to our people. So we didn't wear the white gloves. We used the white sage to meet their requirement. And so as we packed them, then we came home, we got them packed. And one of the ceremonial ladies, she had picked up the young girl and cried when she put her in the cedar box. And when she was crying, she said, I asked her later on, why were you crying so hard? And she said, because she was never hugged. No one ever hugged her, and she deserved to be hugged. And there was a bullet hole in her head, in the skull, evident. And seeing that bullet hole is what brought back all the anger, the emotions, the pain, the suffering that she went through. Very hard, difficult to see that. These young children never had a chance to live a full life. And so when you look at that thing, when you look at repatriation, it's not just a thing like Chip said. This is a living culture of people. We're living today, we're not going nowhere. We're here today as Cheyenne people. We're here today as Arapaho people. We're going to always move forward. We're going to learn from the process of what our ancestors went through to better improve ourselves and how we're going to handle these types of situations in repatriation. And so once we got her home, then we buried them in our tribal cemetery. And we put the little girl in the middle. We put the men on the outside of her so the men could protect her and no one would ever bother her again. And that was the purpose of burying her in the tribal cemetery. All of them, 13 of them, because our tribal cemetery is under trust property. It's protected by the United States government. And so if anyone tried to go over there and remove them, they would be potentially, they would have to face consequences from the federal side and tribal side. And so you have to think of all those things of how this NAGPRA affects your tribe. How does NAGPRA fulfill the obligation of your traditional responsibility, bringing them remains home? How does repatriation heal us? We felt like by returning them home here, it started the healing process. We shed tears for that little girl and all of them. And so we relieved some of our tension, some of our pain, some of our suffering. And that healing process started. So repatriation is a very challenging process. And it's to return something to its rightful place, return something back to its original place of where it came from. And then we had to learn all that. I had to learn all of that process, the language of the law, how we're going to do it. And so that's what helped me in my repatriation. And I'm very thankful that I was given an opportunity. And I'm very thankful that I was guided by the elders. You have to have trust. You have to have trust from the elders because the elders are going to guide you. You have to work with them. And if you don't have that trust, then you're not going to have respect either. The most important thing is building trust relationships with any elder in your community, your leaders, and then you start those working relationships with museums and institutions. And then you apply that traditional way of how we handle ourselves personally, as a tribe. Then you start that process of how we're going to do this. And he used the word negotiation. And, you know, it's kind of difficult when we talk about negotiation. It's always having to have leverage to do something. But for me, if I can do something that's of educational value for someone else to follow, that's my whole goal in this process. And so we brought them home, and it was 1993 when we buried them in June. It was during the season when all the plants, the sacred plants, the medicines were at full bloom, new life, new moon. And that's the time of our renewal ceremony for the sun dance. And so we brought them home and buried them during that month. And it was a very successful repatriation. And again, I said there's a video out, the long journey home. And all of the old men that were in that video, they're no longer here. Except one or, I think just one or two. But they're up in age. I think one of them's still with us today. He's 87 years old. And we still talk about how we brought him home. And that was our responsibility as leaders. And so you start to work good with these museums, work good with these federal agencies, because he mentioned the Department of Transportation. That's a federal entity. Anything that has human remains, like what he said, the discovery, the inadvertent discovery of a human remain, you have to understand all those words. And you know, it's something we had to learn. It's something I had to learn. And then I would interpret those words, the language, to the elders in layman's term, our language, the Cheyenne language, the Arapaho language. And they would have a better understanding. Oh, okay, I know what they're saying now. I know what they mean. So that's what we did. But it was in 1993, and 10 years later, the National Park Service created the Sand Creek National Historic Site. And if we would have seen the future of 10 years, we probably would have waited to repatriate them, and we probably would have buried them at the National Park Service Sand Creek National Massacre Site. But we didn't know, and we couldn't see the future 10 years ahead of us. So now there were talk about, let's dig them back up and send them to Colorado, where they were, and they'll be at the National Park Service. And it created a lot of hard feelings, it created emotions, and we said, no, we've already laid them to rest and we don't want to disturb them again. However, future remains that might be related to Sand Creek, we will do that, and we have. We returned other objects that came from Sand Creek to the National Park Service unit at Sand Creek National Historic Site. And so it's working. And I encourage other tribes to take the lead and do their responsibility. And always remember, you got elected government officials and you got traditional leaders in your communities. So there's two that has to work together to make it successful. And if you have that leadership working together, it's going to come out to be more powerful in success in achieving and accomplishing your goal of repatriation. And always keep in mind that you're there for their human remain. You're there to repatriate them. You're not there for yourself, and you're not there for the museum. You're there for that human remain. And so I want to come to a conclusion there. I think it's important that we talk and have questions, because this is an important thing. And like I said, I've been fortunate to work for my tribe 28 years. And I'm currently serving as the Language and Culture Program Director. But repatriation is very powerful. It's a tool that we can use that's going to bring our people home. And to me, that's important.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you so much, Gordon and Chip, for that. That was absolutely wonderful. I think right now we're going to invite our audience to ask questions. So go ahead, and if you have any questions for Chip or Gordon or both of them, go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we will read those once we get them. I'm going to start off with a question while people are kind of mulling over what they might want to ask. And this one is, I recently came across a quote that resonated with me. And it's, if you are in a group of people and making decisions that directly affect another group of people, and you look around and see no one from that other group at the table, you need to be very wary of the conclusions you reach. And to me, after reading this book, it sounds a lot like how museum decisions many museum decisions were made prior to NAGPRA. And it also makes me think that it's very easy to convince ourselves that the work we're doing is right, and that the feeling of being right is an alluring one and a satisfying one. And in this instance, in the time before and during the early days of NAGPRA, many academics and museum professionals were wrong. And so it makes me wonder, with the experience of you both and what you both have been through, what is your advice for avoiding this trap of knowing you're right? What lessons have you learned along the way that help you to think more flexibly and openly and kind of more empathetically with other people?
Gordon, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. One of the things that has helped me is you really got to be creative in how you're going to follow the process, how you're going to develop. Just going back to the policies, they had their policies of how they pack things, but we were creative, and we were creative in how we were going to meet those guidelines. And always remember to think about that, being creative of how you're going to follow that process. And once you approach the museums and you work with them and start talking to them, then they have a better understanding of your cultural needs. And that's important, understanding cultural needs and respecting them. And sometimes, there's a thing that we have to feed the spirits. And sometimes with museum collections, we always have to offer food to the spirit of those remains. And the museums, they won't allow food in their collections. So we have to use zip bags and make offerings and use those zip bags to place them near or at the base of those remains. So it is being creative. And then once you have that creativeness of how you're going to meet the policy, then they're going to accept that more. They're going to be more respectful. And in turn, I'm going to learn from them as well too, because I want to learn how they do things, how they care for those collections. And when you physically see it, then you have an understanding of, oh yeah, now I know, now I get it. And this is how we're going to do it. So dialogue is important. And that's my answer to that question.
Yeah, I think to riff off that, and maybe just putting it in a slightly different way is, I think especially if we look at the history of the repatriation debates in NAGPRA, there really was a kind of culture clash between different value systems, different ways of looking at the world. And, I think a lot, and I thought a lot about my predecessor at the museum, someone who Gordon knew, and she came of scholarly age in the 1960s, where curators were trained to deeply appreciate objects for themselves, believing that objects could speak for themselves, and that the job of the curator was to collect as many things as possible and to preserve them forever. And that was the ideology and the practices of curators. I'm simplifying it a bit, but to give you a sense of, she was raised and came of age as a scholar and a curator in a time when those were the kinds of values that she was taught, and those were the values that were celebrated by society. So everything in her world confirmed that those were the right things to be doing. And then all of a sudden you have, maybe for the first time ever, people within museums talking to Native American elders or knowledge keepers, cultural experts, and suddenly they're challenging all of those assumptions, whether it's, whether objects can speak for themselves, where they belong, the rights of communities to those objects, whether things can actually be preserved forever or they're better served as living objects in communities, right? And so it really was this kind of culture clash. So I think to go to your second question there, this idea of being right, I think it's helpful for us to be deeply reflexive of our own values, our own assumptions, our own ideologies, and also to really cultivate empathy for how other people see the world and try to understand, okay, if they disagree with me, why are they disagreeing? Where is that really coming from? And trying to understand some of the very deep roots that lead to these kinds of conflicts. I think I would just add to the first point you raised that absolutely, I think especially after this summer, I think a lot of people are asking themselves about questions of representation and voice, thinking about questions, of racial justice. And certainly there just simply aren't enough Native Americans in archaeology, anthropology, and the museum profession. And so I think, first and foremost, it is just incumbent upon all of us in those professions to do the work to change that, to create partnerships with tribal colleges and universities, with tribal museums, shifting the pipeline in very real ways so that we can expand these disciplines and become truly more inclusive. Because without those voices and perspectives in the room when those decisions are being made, it's very hard to hear them.
Thank you both so much for that. I have to apologize. My video has stopped working on my computer, so you're just going to hear me from here on out, I think. But we do have quite a few questions from our audience, so I'm going to start in there. And one of those is, what are NAGPRA's remaining problems?
What do you think, Gordon?
Well, I think NAGPRA's remaining problems is it's time, There's not enough time, that the time to, we as Native people want to speed the process of repatriating our human remains, our ancestors. And for us, it's difficult because it takes a tremendous amount of time. Here we are 30 years after NAGPRA, and what have we accomplished? I think we've successfully repatriated maybe no more than 50 remains. And so it's time consuming. It takes time to do this. I understand it, but we also want them to return quickly. And so I think the challenge with that is they have a process as well. And so you have to, the clash that he mentioned, it's a clash of time. We don't look at linear time. Our time is circular movement. There's a time when we do things seasonal. And so, when we apply all of that into how we're going to be returning our people, when are we going to return them? That's the big question. And so now with all of the mass amount of the high number of unidentifiable human remains yet to be culturally identified, that's going to be a long process. And when is that process going to end? It's just like the question we face now, when is this pandemic going to end? We don't know. If you parallel that to the unidentifiable, culturally unidentifiable in time, or asking the question when, it's almost equal. We don't know, but yet we have hope, and that's what's going to get us through this. That's the best way I can answer that.
Yeah, I think there's there's a handful of very concrete things that could be done to improve the law and its implementation right now. As Gordon points out, time is a very real one, and my sense is a lot of tribes are very limited by the amount of person hours they can put on this work, and so are museums. One way of the government could immediately address that is by increasing the amount of money that's provided to support NAGPRA work. So the last time I looked at the numbers, there's a grant program within the law of NAGPRA, and typically only about 50% of those applications are actually funded. And this is not supposed to be a competitive grant program, right? It's just based on need. So that means about every year, about half the museums and tribes that want to do the work and need the resources aren't getting it to do the work. So, you know, that's like something very concretely that the government could do right now to change the pace at which NAGPRA is addressed. You know, I think to put some numbers too on what Gordon was saying, you know, so there's kind of these one way of thinking about it is almost kind of two categories. There's items and human remains, ancestral remains that are determined to be culturally affiliated, which allows for a pretty straightforward process for the legal return of those individuals. And then there's so-called culturally unaffiliated. And those culturally unaffiliated people kind of live in this uncertain region where it's unclear what's ever going to happen to them in a lot of cases. And even after 30 years of NAGPRA, about 70% of human remains in collections in the United States are in this nebulous category of culturally unaffiliated. So 70% after 30 years of work. So there's huge amounts of work that still are to be done. And then when I worked on my book and I added up the numbers, so this is 2017, at the current pace of repatriation, I determined or guessed that it would be about 238 years until all of the human remains in US collections were addressed. So generations of work ahead of us. And that doesn't even include all of the human remains and sacred items that are in the United States, but not in federally funded museums or federal collections, as well as outside of the United States, that we know there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Native American ancestors in museums in places like France and England and Germany. So, you know, I think there's some concrete things we can do, but I also think, as Gordon's is saying, you know, we have to embrace that this is work on a generational scale.
Thank you both. All right, we have a question. What are some ways you could see future Indigenous scholars helping bridging the gaps between the worlds of government and academia and understanding an Indigenous perspective?
Gordon, want to take that one first again?
And you can go first.
You know, I kind of want to riff off Gordon's earlier points too again here, where I think one thing that certainly comes to mind is, first of all, the power of language, the way language in a very concrete way shapes our concepts of the world, but also shapes power dynamics and how like the law is implemented and what the law even is. And so language is power. And at the same time, there's this, I think, big disconnect between how I hear many Native elders and knowledge keepers talk about the things that are important to them, their values, their perceptions of history, and how archaeologists and museums and anthropologists, lawyers and politicians, they talk about these things, you know? So I think, to begin with, for me, I think a very good, important beginning place, if we're talking about bridging worlds, is thinking about language and thinking about what kinds of words we can use, what kinds of concepts we can use that help us make sense of these different ways of understanding the world. And I think if we could do that, we could understand each other a lot better.
Well, I think it, you know, when we talk about the federal laws, the mandates, the requirements of the law, how do you apply that law? How does this work? Again, I think it's important that you parallel those traditions, the languages, the cultural way of life into the subject part or the academic part of scientific knowledge is equal to traditional knowledge of our people. My knowledge that I have is equal to a PhD, because that's I am the primary resource I'm not the secondary. And if you look at the tribes that lived the cultural living way of life that was in the past, we're still here, present, you apply all of that into the future, whether it's scientific, whether it's traditional knowledge, utilize all those concepts and start bridging the gap. And then when we talk about hypothesis, theories, we talk about stories of oral origins of where we came from. We talk about not just the physical world, the spiritual, not just the earth. We talk about the universe, stars, the moon, the sun. We have relationships with those because they have power. And we use that power to empower ourselves into our cultural way of life. And so science is something that's there. We're always going to have to deal with it academically, but we're also going to have to deal with it understanding knowledge. So utilize both. And if you got those things, those tools, and the academic world starts listening to us, then it's gonna have a better understanding of bridging that world, our indigenous world, and then the way the world society is today. Right now we're going fast, too fast. We need to slow down. And for me, he's shown us that we do need to slow down because he presented something in front of us that we don't know how to deal with. And science is racing to try to determine how we're going to deal with this. Now I might go and say, I'm going to use my traditional plants, my medicines. Always be aware there's things like that. And so put all that together and we can all move forward for the best interests of our people and our way of life.
Yeah, I think, Gordon, you sharing all that with us reminded me of a scene from an earlier book that I wrote about a man named Arthur Parker. And Arthur Parker was the first, he's known today as the first Native American archaeologist. And he grew up in the late 1800s in New York and had a really rich childhood and dreamed of becoming an archaeologist. And he finally had his big chance. He kind of connected himself to the most famous archaeologists in all of the world at that point, Frederick Putnam. And he was at Harvard, and Putnam finally sent him on this expedition. And Parker went back to the Cattaraugus Reservation where he was raised and born with his community, with the Seneca people. And his job as an archaeologist was to fill the shelves at the Peabody Harvard Museum. And so where do you go to get the good stuff, right? You're an archaeologist in 1903, you go to the cemetery. So his first week of being an archaeologist, he's digging up all of his ancestors' remains to get skeletons and objects. And the elders come to him. We know this from letters that were written. The elders come to him and they say, please stop. Stop digging up our people. This isn't right. And what was doubly tragic was not only that Parker did that, but that he had to make a choice. In 1903, you either had to be Native American and follow, the beliefs of your culture, or you had to be an archaeologist and you had to dig up graves. There was no kind of framework, within the field where you could try to work to bring these two different views together in mutual respect and mutual benefit. So I think that's also what we need. We need kind of new ways of thinking, new frameworks that that allow these different ways of thinking about the world together in a real meaningful dialogue to create something new. And I think when we do that, we are going to be creating something that's radically different from where we've been together these past years.
Thank you both. That kind of following along that line, it makes me think of the importance of collaborative work. And Chip, I know you've written with TJ Ferguson, the collaborative continuum, and it kind of leads us into this next question in how we go about starting these relationships. And we have a question from someone who's saying, incorporating Indigenous perspectives into my research is extremely important to me, but I find myself a bit lost on where to start. Do you have any advice on how to initiate relationships with Indigenous communities? If you can shed light on how to do this for people early in their academic career, that would be especially helpful.
Gordon, how do you recommend people collaborate with the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes if they're interested?
Well, I think if you think about it, both from the cultural side and the academic side, you know, you're at an institution of learning, higher learning. And we're here at an institution of tribal government. And so you want to go out and start collaborating, but find out, do research, you know, find out who the tribe is, where they're located, where they come from. And see, for us, we were forcibly removed from our homelands. We came from the Minnesota and Great Lakes region. And we were forced to move to Oklahoma like 39 other federally recognized tribes. We're here located in Indian Territory, but we had other places of our home places out of state. And so when you follow the history of those people, start looking in and understanding how they were, what they went through to get to where they are today, then understand that, research them, and go to their tribal offices and go to their websites and find out who you need to talk to. They're gonna have a directory there of cultural programs, language programs, leadership, your chairman. For us, it's the governor and lieutenant governor and legislators. And they all know they serve their communities. And then you have your traditional leaders who are not non-elected tribal officials. They're traditional leaders in the communities that live among their people. Get to know them. And whatever area you're going to study, your discipline, go out and talk to them. And say, hey, I'm kind of interested in this. And who do I talk to? And they're going to send you to the right person or the appropriate program or program person to address what your interests are and visit with you. You know, the other thing is we talk about how you have to get permission from your university to come out here to whether you're going to interview us or study us or just talk to us. You have to get that approved by your advisors. And so how do we approve it here? What is our process of speaking to students outside of our tribal government? And we may have a process. There may be a process that you have to go through there too as well. So always be aware that we have rules and just like any other institution, and follow that.
Yeah, and I think building on that, you know, it's like the Nike or the Nike saying, you know, just do it. You know, I think I just recommend, you know, just try it. And, you know, if you're lucky, I was really lucky. I had a mentor, TJ Ferguson, who helped show me the way. But I've also seen other grad students just do it on their own. And for me, a real turning point a long time ago was when I realized that almost very few native, essentially no native peoples I've met in 20 years of doing this are anti-science. What they're against is a science that violates people's sense of dignity, their rights, their concerns for their communities, right? So I think it's about finding projects, it's about building relationships that find that kind of common ground. And when you work towards that, you know, you can reach out to people like Gordon. He's a real nice guy. And, you know, most tribes, they have folks who are, you know, positioned to look at potential projects and partnerships. I can also say, I think, Gordon, like, you're a pretty busy guy, right? So you may not say yes to every single project, or you can't do every single project, but it's still worth the effort of trying, and you can learn a lot through that. And often those conversations can lead maybe to projects down the road, or may point you to a different community to work with. And there's a lot of tribes out there that actually have even formal protocols set up for you to do research with them collaboratively, like the Hopi tribe. You just go to their website and you see their application procedure, and it's all there. So I think I feel like my sense is there's often a lot of fear of of the unknown, of the uncertainty, because often collaboration is a kind of unknown path, but once you get on that path, it's really rewarding. And I think it's relatively easy to find partners if your heart's in the right place and you're looking for projects that are based on mutual respect and mutual benefit.
Thank you. All right, let's see. We have, there seems to still be a lack of equity in the process of repatriation. Is inclusion merely enough in these cases? Can a deeper sense of cultural empathy actually be achieved through regulations like NAGPRA?
I would say the law itself does not provide sort of equal rights, if you will, to museums or collecting agencies on the one hand, and lineal descendants and tribes on the other. There's incredible inequities throughout the whole process. Just for example, as just one example, as I mentioned, cultural affiliation is one of the key concepts within the law, and it is the museum or the agency that is empowered under the law to make that determination. So essentially, museums, if they took something, they're the ones that get to decide if a potential claimant or a community actually has a right to have that item or ancestor returned. So the law itself is not equal. And so in that sense, I don't think, the law by itself is enough. At the same time, I don't think it's realistic to just throw out the law. I don't think we can just do away with it and start again, And so I think what we can see is that repatriation in NAGPRA, it's really just a framework. It's really just a process at the end of the day. And it's up to the individuals within those institutions and with tribes to navigate how to implement the law itself, how to actually go through the process. And so I see a lot of museums that kind of use NAGPRA as a way to resist returning ancestors or objects, and it becomes an excuse. It becomes something to get in the way of actually creating meaningful relationships with tribes. And then I see other museums that use the exact same law, the exact same process and framework to do the exact opposite, to create deep, meaningful, powerful, lasting relationships with tribes that not only facilitate returns, but also often lead to all other kinds of flourishing partners and projects. So, so I think the law at the end of the day needs to be interpreted. It needs to be acted upon, and that is where it's this question of interpretation. It's this question of attitude, ideology, and practice that really matters most. So I definitely get this. I understand, I think, the premise of that question, but I think on the ground, it is really practical to think about using the law, but in ways that really equalize relationships between museums and tribes.
Thanks, Chip. In chapter 12, Chip, you ask Joe Big Medicine the question, can repatriation heal? He responds to you by saying, no, NAGPRA doesn't heal, but the process does. I know this kind of healing is something that is never entirely finished and is ongoing, but I wonder what it has looked like for either of you, Chip, over the course of your career, and Gordon, your personal experience, as well as your years working with NAGPRA and your tribal government.
Would you like to start with that one, Gordon?
Well, I think, first of all, I want to say, I'm glad that you mentioned Joe's name here tonight, because we just recently lost him. He passed on and went on to the spirit world, but he did tremendous work at the Sand Creek Massacre, right beside my Uncle Larry Cummett-Siwa and his wife, Colleen Cummett-Siwa. They were the ones that started the process of identifying lineal descendancy with the Sand Creek Massacre way before the law. And so the genealogy of understanding your families is very important, where you come from, where you're headed, and where are we going from here. So it's important to know your relatives. And going back to this question of how it helped us heal, I think in healing, there's a thing called acceptance. And there's a thing called process of time. I mentioned time. It doesn't say at 5 o'clock Friday night, I'm going to be healed. That's not going to happen. And again, we accept our healing process of when we're ready to come out of mourning, when we're ready to face the world again and be full and following our traditions. When we lose a loved one, we are supposed to mourn for 1 year, 4 seasons. And so when you start talking about how does this heal, have I accepted an apology for what was done? Some have, some haven't. So it's up to individuals as well as community leaders to come forth and say, hey, let's start this healing process. Let's accept the apology. Let's move forward. And so it all depends on how and when you're ready. And this law doesn't have a deadline. Doesn't say 2021, NAGPRA's over. And when you look at it from a Native perspective, such as me, and when you ask and challenge the academic value of scientific value of research, they had all those years, over 100 years to do research on those remains, and they didn't. So that time has come, your research, you had that opportunity and you missed it. So those are some of the values of tradition that we look at. And it's hard for the scientific people, the academic people, to understand the cultural value, which is all equal. No value is greater than the other. And so what I'm trying to say is healing is going to be determined by not only the remains that you're repatriating, or where they came from. Provenience, that's another word. Where'd they come from? And once you understand that, the emotional part of where they came from is going to have greater value affecting our emotions than it might to another remain somewhere else. Provenience, location. And so when you start to prioritize all of that, then you can say, okay, I think I'm healing now. I'm ready to heal. And so that's the best answer I can give for that healing process. It's a continuum. And when we're ready to say we're healed, then we know ourselves that in following this process, following our traditional process, we know when that healing is over, and we can go about our lives again and enjoy ourselves.
Yeah, I think just to add a few words to that would be thinking about, as I write about in the book, from what I observed and from what I learned, people spoke a lot about, healing. And I think for a lot of readers, I think they might think of healing as, like something like a, broken bone that's just fully mended, or, a gash, a wound that just disappears. Whereas I think what I hear a lot is really these wounds are scars, they deeply scar. And so those scars, in a sense, never go away, that they always remain, they're always kind of present, that it's inescapable. And at the same time, those scars are a symbol and much more of survival. They show that a people, a community, peoples plural, have outlived whatever it is that threatened them or that harmed them. And so I think there's a real power to the metaphor of the wound and healing. But I think, as Gordon so eloquently put, it's going to be very, I think, individual and very dependent on people's own perspectives and the things they learn along the way, how they view history and how they view their future.
One of the things that's talked about today is historical trauma. And they even say it's in our DNA because we were scarred. And Sanskrit was one of those historical trauma events, the atrocity that we faced. And so you got to think about what happened in that time, what occurred, and how it affected us as a generation.
Thank you both. So one thing that I think is pretty interesting, given these conversations and the development of these relationships with museums and tribes, and that even when there are good faith efforts on both sides, there can still be politics, delays, bureaucracy. And clearly the process, although meaningful and important, can be very cumbersome and plodding and exhaustive at times. And I'm wondering how you two managed to maintain sanity throughout this, and how you held on and kept moving forward, and how you deal with these additional obstacles on top of everything else.
For me, it's working with people like Gordon. It's the relationships that you have. It's the sense of privilege and honor that you get by working with tribal elders and knowledge keepers. It's that, and for me as a white anthropologist, it's knowing that however hard it is for me at whatever point in the process, it's just knowing how much harder it has been and could be for so many other people, especially the tribal folks that I'm often collaborating with. So, I take a lot of power and strength from the people I get to work with. And, that's, I think, sustained me and then also motivates me. It encourages me to keep working so that I can keep learning and trying to do better too.
Well, I too, that, you really have to understand, again, working through the process. Yeah, there's going to be politics. There's going to be tribal politics because for me, we have to educate our tribal leaders to make them understand what we're doing in this process and how we're going to do that throughout this process. Yes, it's exhaustive. We get tired, not only physically, emotionally, mentally, you're drained. But sometimes we have to come to we have to take a break. We have to say, let's just walk away and gather ourselves again, or myself again, to think about this, and then just kind of let it rest at its own, let it breathe at its own. And then we'll go back and pick it up, and then complete that process. There's a physical and spiritual strength. And when you talk about the remains, the deceased, you're dealing with the spiritual part of it, their spirit. Yeah, you have the physical remains in front of you, but remember the spiritual value is very powerful, and it can affect you. And it's very hard. And so we always have to have our protective shield, our protective rituals, our protective songs, our protective chants, our protective language of speaking to the remains. And one thing that we come to understand is the remains that we talk to, they don't understand English. They only understand Cheyenne. So you have to talk to them that way. And you have to remember that. Language is very key and powerful. And they don't know what the scientists are saying. But when you go over there and talk to them in Cheyenne and talk to their spirit, they're going to acknowledge you. And they will let you know that they're there. And it's the power, like Sandman. When we studied him at the University of Oklahoma, San Noble, Oklahoma Museum of Natural History, Sandman was a very powerful warrior. And the day we uncovered him at the school there, the lights started flickering off and on. And this great big old roll of thunder went over the building. And the scientists there, they all stopped. The archaeologists, people working with us, they stopped. What is that? And I told them, I said, we forgot to do a ritual before we uncovered him. So cover him back up and we'll do it now. He's letting us know his power. And after we did that, the lights came back on. And the lights were, the camera lady, she kept plugging her cameras in, her computers and the lights. And the camera lady, they kept popping the plugins. The lights kept blowing out. She had to change the bulbs. And it just wouldn't work. And finally I stopped and I said, I'm gonna have to ask you a personal question. I don't want you to get angry at me. I don't want you to get mad at me. I don't want you to think any way of me asking you this. But I said, are you pregnant? And she said, yes, I am. How did you know that? I said, I didn't know that. He knew it. Pregnant women, Cheyenne women, are not allowed to look at the dead. So he was showing you the power he has by blowing all these lights. She said, all these years I've been working, that has never, ever happened to me. And so we went through a ritual and we told her not to look at it. After that, the lights and cameras and everything start working. Powerful. So remember the spiritual side of it. Be careful when you work with these collections. You call them collections, we call them ancestors.
Thank you so much for that. And I think actually it's a great place to draw to a close for this evening. On behalf of the audience, OKPAN and myself, I want to thank you both so much for giving your time to us and your words and your energy and your thoughts tonight. It's so appreciated and it was so moving. And we have another event this Sunday that